The lecture hall shimmered with light from the glass canopy above, refracting the pale blue sun into fractured beams that danced across rows of alien faces. Most of the students had been warned. Today's lesson included the human exchange cadet, which meant something unpredictable was about to happen. Kryll, a spindly Varric with translucent scales, leaned forward in his seat, mandibles clacking in quiet irritation. Fragile, he whispered to his companion, a broad-shelled Eltari who responded with a guttural hum of agreement. To them, humans were an evolutionary paradox. Too soft-skinned, too limited in lifespan, too prone to injury to be considered serious contenders in galactic academia. Yet here one sat, just a few rows down, scribbling furiously into a battered notebook as though the lecture's content were a matter of survival. Cadet Marcus Hale was nothing remarkable to look at, medium height, lean but not imposing, dark hair that seemed perpetually untamed, and eyes that scanned the room with a quick, restless energy. His uniform bore the same insignia as theirs, though the fabric was worn at the edges. To the aliens around him, Marcus looked out of place, like a relic of a species desperately trying to prove it belonged. To Marcus, the room felt like an ambush, rows of curious stares dissecting him, every glance heavy with skepticism. Professor Hervek, whose 4 eyes blinked asynchronously as he addressed the class, tapped the holodisplay. A projection flickered to life above his desk, a simulation of interspecies endurance trials. Today we explore the limits of biological resilience, he declared in his gravelly voice. A comparative study between cadets from varying evolutionary backgrounds. The air shifted, anticipation mingled with disdain. The aliens expected Marcus to fail, perhaps even collapse, and the possibility thrilled them. Nothing unified the galaxy's many species quite like mocking the human myth of tenacity. When volunteers were requested, Marcus's hand went up instantly. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. The professor's upper eyelids raised, an expression of mild surprise, before nodding in acknowledgement. Human Cadet Hale! Step forward. The challenge was simple: withstand exposure to simulated environmental stressors projected within the training field. Students would endure heat, simulated gravity fluctuations, and oxygen reduction, all in controlled measures. For most species, this was a test of limits, one they had trained for. For a human, the class assumed, it was folly. Marcus stepped into the circular chamber at the center of the hall, the glass walls sealing around him. He glanced up at the gallery of alien faces pressed against the barrier, watching him as one might a doomed insect. He rolled his shoulders once, as if preparing for a jog rather than a trial designed to break bodies. The first wave struck, heat rose sharply, air shimmering as the temperature climbed to levels that made even the observers twitch uncomfortably in their seats. Kryll leaned forward, expecting panic. Instead, Marcus removed his jacket and tied it around his waist, sweat beading across his skin but his expression set with determination. He remained standing, eyes fixed on the professor. The second wave, gravity doubled, pressing down on his shoulders, forcing his knees to bend. The Eltari students chuckled, clicking their armored mandibles in mocking amusement. Marcus clenched his jaw and spread his stance, fighting the weight that seemed determined to pin him to the ground. His muscles quivered, but he stayed upright. One foot slid back an inch, stabilizing him, and he raised a hand in a half-hearted wave toward the audience, lips quirking into a grin that was equal parts defiance and humor. By the third wave, the chamber's oxygen levels dropped. A murmur ran through the students. This was where the fragile mammal would falter. Marcus's breaths grew loud, ragged, echoing against the chamber's glass. His chest rose and fell with visible effort, yet his eyes sharpened, not dulled. He mouthed something, words lost to the barrier, but the shape of them was unmistakable, still here. Inside the gallery, silence spread. Kryll's mandibles twitched nervously. Professor Hervek tilted his head, 4 eyes narrowing as he adjusted the trial parameters slightly higher, curious now rather than expectant. The fragile one should have been on the floor by now. Instead, Marcus took one staggering step forward, then another, dragging himself toward the center, as though daring the environment to crush him. The chamber lights dimmed abruptly, the system reaching its automated cutoff before safety thresholds were breached. The barriers dissolved, and Marcus collapsed onto one knee, dragging in a lungful of sweet, restored air. His skin glistened with sweat, muscles trembling, yet he lifted his head and gave a crooked smile to the stunned hall. "That all you've got?" he rasped. The silence that followed was heavier than the gravity field had been. Students who had come expecting to laugh at human fragility found themselves speechless. Kyla looked away, mandibles clamped shut, while the Altari beside him shifted uncomfortably in his shell. The myth of human resilience no longer seemed so mythic. Professor HFY studied Marcus with new weight in his gaze, the kind reserved not for specimens but for rivals. The human had not just endured, he had defied expectation with sheer stubborn will. And that, the professor realized, was far more dangerous than strength or physiology. As Marcus rose shakily to his feet, brushing damp hair from his forehead, the room's attention locked onto him. He wasn't the frail outlier anymore. He was the unpredictable element, the variable that couldn't be calculated. The kind of creature that made the galaxy uneasy. And for Marcus, standing there in the sudden silence, one thought burned sharper than the ache in his lungs. He had just painted a target on his back. Would you like me to keep the tone cinematic and tense like this for Section 2, or should the next part shift toward more interpersonal dynamics, rivalries, alliances forming, before the main conflict escalates? The cafeteria was a cacophony of clattering trays, the hum of voices in a dozen alien tongues weaving into an uneven chorus. Marcus sat at the edge of one table, posture relaxed but eyes sharp, his fork prodding at a gray mass that passed for protein. The trial had ended hours ago, yet whispers still followed him down every corridor. Some carried awe, some suspicion, and many laced with disbelief. It didn't matter to him whether they admired or despised him. What mattered was that they had stopped ignoring him. Kyl and his companion entered, their gaze sweeping across the room until it landed on Marcus. They made no effort to hide their disdain as they passed his table. Kyl muttered, low enough to seem private but loud enough to be heard. "Stubbornness is not strength." Marcus didn't look up. He just smirked, stabbed another bite of food, and replied evenly, "Tell that to the part of you that expected me to be dead." The words hung there, daring a response, but Kyl kept walking. Despite his casual veneer, Marcus was acutely aware of his isolation. He was the only human in the academy, and the unspoken rule of the place was that outliers didn't survive long, socially or otherwise. The endurance trial had shifted the narrative, but not in a way that guaranteed his safety. Now, instead of being underestimated, he was being watched, measured, and perhaps even feared. He wasn't sure if that was an improvement. Later that evening, he found himself in the training bay, the smell of heated metal and lubricants sharp in the air. Holographic drones hovered in neat formations, awaiting commands. Professor HFY had assigned a paired combat simulation, one designed to test cooperative instincts across species. Marcus scanned the list on the console and found his assigned partner, Kyl. The irony wasn't lost on him. Kyl arrived moments later, his movements precise, his translucent scales glinting beneath the bay's sterile lights. His mandibles clicked in irritation. "I refuse," he hissed. The supervising officer, an Altari with a shell that gleamed like obsidian, only narrowed his eyes. "Refusal means failure for both. Begin." The simulation activated, and the drones fanned out, their forms shifting into hostile constructs armed with energy projectors. Marcus tightened his fists, then glanced at Kyl. "You want to survive this? Follow my lead." Kyl's mandibles flared, but he complied, driven more by instinct than respect. The first drone swooped low. Marcus ducked beneath its beam, rolling across the floor and hurling a scrap of metal into its sensor node. The machine sputtered, spiraled, and slammed into the wall in a shower of sparks. Kyl, startled, lashed out with a sharp limb, slicing through another drone that had veered too close. The two moved with different rhythms, Marcus with reckless improvisation, Kyl with calculated precision. Alone, either might have been overwhelmed. Together, they began to carve a path through the swarm. But as the drones adapted, tightening their formation, Marcus recognized the trap. They were being herded, forced into a narrow corridor with no cover. He pressed his back against the wall, breath ragged, and shouted over the chaos. "You've got reach, I've got speed. If we split their focus, we can break out." KRYL hesitated only a moment before nodding, the alien equivalent of trust. They launched forward. Marcus darted between beams, closing the distance to one drone and tearing out its stabilizer with his bare hands, even as searing heat licked his arm. KRYL swept behind him, using his claws to dismember another. For a few harrowing minutes, they fought as though they'd trained together for years. Then, just as the last drone fell sparking to the floor, the simulation ended. The room returned to silence, the scorched marks on the walls the only evidence of the struggle. KRYL stood tall, mandibles clicking in uncertainty as he studied Marcus, not with scorn this time, but something sharper, more cautious. "You court death with every move," he said. Marcus grinned through his sweat. "Yeah. But death hasn't caught me yet." The supervising officer dismissed them, though his eyes lingered on Marcus longer than on KRYL. The human's performance wasn't just remarkable, it was unsettling. Word of the session would spread, and not all who heard it would be impressed. Strength in the academy was more than physical. It was political, and Marcus had just upset the balance. That night, as he sat alone in his quarters, the silence pressed heavily against him. His muscles ached, his arm throbbed where the simulated burn had seared, but his mind was sharper than ever. The endurance trial had made him visible. The combat simulation had made him dangerous. Both painted the same target across his back. On the other side of the academy, KRYL reported to a cluster of fellow Varik. His recounting of the simulation was terse, but the undertone was unmistakable. The human was not a fluke. He was a problem. And problems, in the academy, were dealt with swiftly. Marcus didn't know it yet, but his greatest trial wasn't surviving the simulations. It was surviving the growing consensus that he didn't belong alive. Do you want Section 3 to escalate straight into open confrontation and betrayal, or should it build more tension first with politics and subtle sabotage before the climax? The Academy's corridors were quieter at night, their sterile white panels humming faintly with recycled air. Marcus moved through them with careful steps, his senses sharp despite exhaustion. He knew when eyes lingered too long, when whispers followed his back, when the air carried tension thicker than recycled oxygen. The combat simulation had sealed it. He wasn't just different, he was disruptive. And in a place where order defined survival, disruption rarely ended well. He found KRYL waiting for him near the observation deck, the stars spilling silver light across the alien's scaled face. For a moment, Marcus thought the Varik had come to finish what envy had begun. Instead, KRYL's mandibles clicked once, softly, almost hesitant. "They speak of removing you." Marcus leaned against the rail, feigning ease though his chest tightened. "By removing, I'm guessing you don't mean expelling me." KRYL didn't respond immediately, and the silence was confirmation enough. Finally, he said, "You do not break as you should. That unsettles them. They will test you again, but this time not within the rules." The warning wasn't kindness, it was practicality. KRYL had seen Marcus fight, had moved with him in rhythm against the drones. Part of him understood what Marcus represented, a variable that couldn't be dismissed. But another part, perhaps stronger, recognized the inevitability of what was coming. The next day, Marcus entered the training yard and felt the trap before it was sprung. A group of cadets loitered near the equipment racks, their voices too casual, their glances too sharp. Among them were two Eltari, shells gleaming under the lights, and a taller Avery whose double-jointed arms twitched in anticipation. KRYL stood apart, silent, his presence less ally than witness. "Human," one of the Eltari called, voice echoing across the yard. "Join us. A friendly spar." Marcus adjusted his stance, pretending to weigh the invitation. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't a spar, it was an ambush dressed in ceremony. But backing down would only mark him as prey. He stepped forward, rolling his shoulders. Sure, he said. Friendly. The first strike came fast, an every lunge, its elongated limbs snapping forward like whips. Marcus twisted, letting the blow glance off his shoulder, then drove an elbow into the alien's midsection. The Evri staggered but recovered with eerie flexibility. The others closed in. It became chaos, shell-clad Eltari slamming down with crushing force, the Evria's limbs sweeping in arcs too wide to anticipate, Marcus ducking, weaving, striking where openings appeared. His body screamed with every impact, but his mind locked into the rhythm of survival. He fought dirty because there was no other way to fight. A shard of broken training equipment became a weapon in his grip, a jagged edge that cut where fists could not. The watching cadets muttered in disbelief as the fragile human refused to fold. Each time Marcus hit the floor, he forced himself back up, blood smearing across his lip, sweat stinging his eyes. They wanted him to shatter, but every blow seemed only to harden his resolve. At last, Marcus drove his makeshift blade into the training mat beside the lead Eltari's head, pinning him with sheer weight rather than cutting him. Breathing hard, chest heaving, he looked around at the stunned circle. "This your idea of friendly?" he growled. The yard fell silent, the defeated cadets glaring up at him with humiliation burning brighter than their bruises. Marcus staggered back, every muscle aching, and caught Kryll's gaze. For the first time, the Varik didn't look like a skeptic. He looked like a witness to something far more dangerous than defiance. He looked like he understood. The silence broke when an instructor stormed into the yard, eyes sweeping the scene. Drones recorded everything. The evidence of an unsanctioned fight was plain. Yet as the officer's gaze lingered on Marcus, there was no reprimand, no accusation, only a flicker of recognition, as though he too now saw what the others had failed to admit. Later, in the solitude of his quarters, Marcus sat slumped against the wall, bruises blossoming across his skin. Every breath ached, every movement pulled at torn muscle, but inside him burned a quiet fire that no beating could snuff out. He knew the truth now: the Academy would not let him exist as he was. They would either try to break him completely, or they would be forced to acknowledge what he represented. And if survival meant dragging himself through every test they devised, if it meant standing bloodied but unbowed before enemies who wanted him erased, then so be it. Out beyond the Academy's walls, stars glittered like scattered shards of broken glass. Somewhere among them, Marcus thought, humanity's reputation was being rewritten, not by speeches, not by diplomacy, but by one stubborn cadet who refused to fall. Do you want me to now expand this into a complete polished draft of 3,000 words across the 3 sections, since each is capped at 1,000, or should I keep building toward the full 5,000-word target by adding more arcs and complications?